Hi everyone, welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the Noontime Live show to kick off your weekend here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'd like to welcome my first guest, former Superintendent of the Rhode Island State Police, Colonel Brendan Daugherty. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate your coming in because big news this week out of the state. Governor Gina Raimondo tapping former Major James Manny to be the new head of the Rhode Island State Police. And you know James Manny well.
I know him well. It's great news for the state police, and I commend the governor in making such a great selection for the future of the state police, because we take a lot of pride in our state police here in this small state, the good work that they do, and have it's such a storied tradition in the Rhode Island State Police, and the folks who work in the trenches, the rank and file, are very proud of what they do, what they represent, and I'm proud of them, and as the former superintendents are as well.
So tell us a little bit about former Major Manny. He took an interesting path, was there at the state police, then he went to be manager of Narragansett, the town manager there. But tell us about his role when he was in the state police. Give us a little background about him.
Yeah, I actually met Jim Manny when he was a Secret Service agent. He was a Secret
you go way back.
Yeah, I go way back with Jim, and then he was a very, very good uniform trooper, and showed leadership qualities, and was promoted through the ranks of the state police. And I think when I retired, I was superintendent from 2007 to 2011. I think when I retired, he was a lieutenant or a captain, and he was in charge of a specific division, barracks, and he just did a great job. He was a go-to person, and he has a nice way about him. He's tough on crime, but he's actually very, very compassionate, and understands that there's people that, especially in this the environment that we've come through in the last few years. Some people are hurting for money. Some people are out of jobs, out of work, and some people need help. And he was also always quick to volunteer. When I started the community outreach program, Jim Manny was, like I've said before, it was service before self, and he did a good job. He understood that what we were trying to, aside from being state police officers, we also had a responsibility to the community to build that trust, and we did that through the community outreach program.
And you mentioned, again, going back with his work with the Secret Service. How does that play into his credentials and how it prepares him to be superintendent?
Well, that's a good question. How that plays out is that he has a good understanding of how the federal agencies work. The Secret Service, people think of the Secret Service as the protective arm of the federal government for the president's security and whatnot, and other dignitaries that come to this country. But it goes beyond that. He was also involved in the Secret Service. Do a good job with bank fraud cases and credit card schemes and things like that. So especially in this difficult time of identity theft in this country, Secret Service do a good job there. Jim was involved in some of those cases years and years ago, and then so he understands how the U.S. attorneys work, and the FBI and the DEA and other federal agencies he would have worked with. But he always had I remember talking to him back then. He just loved the Rhode Island State Police. He was a Rhode Island guy from Cranston, born and raised in Cranston, and wanted to become a trooper, and he made it into the academy and did very well, and has had a great career, and I'm happy that he's back.
And so he's, having been with the state police and then going to the town manager position in Narragansett, he's got some civilian experience. What does that bring to the table?
Yeah, that's a good thing, because I had retired from the state police. I was the first one to retire from the state police and then come back again as superintendent. And you actually do, you learn a lot once you step out of the ranks of the state police. You learn a lot about how businesses run and whatnot. And so he's learned a lot about budget and how to run a town, so he'll know how to manage the state police budget very well, and how to be conservative with the state police budget.
And let's talk about outgoing Colonel Anna Sempko. She's gotten a lot of credit for recruiting a more diverse class, and just wanted to talk with you a little bit about that, the role of the diversity plays in the state police.
Well, sure. That class that they're talking about has not started yet. It's, I believe, begins sometime in January. I'm retired, so I shouldn't comment on when the class starts, but I've heard it's sometime in January. But I do know from talking to Ann and from talking to others that she put a heavy emphasis on diversity and did a nice job with that. I recall when I was a superintendent, I ran a school in 2011, and we had a heavy emphasis on diversity. But sometimes you struggle because there's sometimes folks decide at the last minute not to accept that position in the academy or whatnot, and it changes the numbers and what you're looking at to become a more diverse organization. And why do you want to do that? Because you want to be reflective of the society you serve. And so I think Ann did a good job there. She certainly put a heavy emphasis on it, and I've spoken to Lieutenant Colonel Philbin about it, and I know that they have worked hard in that area.
And so when he takes the role, looking ahead to 2019, from your perspective, what will be the biggest challenges for him as he takes the position, if, again, that gets appointed by the Senate?
Well, what are the biggest challenges? Well, he'll have to set his own mark as far as highway safety, criminal investigations. The state police has always been there for the people of the state of Rhode Island in political corruption cases, for example. So that comes under the Detective Bureau, and they work very closely with the Attorney General. And we have a great new Attorney General, and Peter Nerona, who's worked many of those cases. I worked many of those cases with Peter throughout the years, and that's something that Jim Manny he'll have to sit down with the U.S. Attorney's Office, with the Attorney General, with the Police Chiefs Association, and with his rank and file, and they respect him. They're happy to have him on board. So that's something that will be first and foremost in his mind. But I have to say, the outgoing superintendent, Anna Sumpico, worked very hard in the last 2 years, and she's to be commended for her work.
And so you talk about the role of the state police, obviously looking into things such as political corruption. When Colonel Sumpico took the charge, obviously the specter of 38 Studios was still looming. One of the sort of big stories nationally that we're seeing around different states are investigations into various dioceses pertaining to sexual abuse and assault in decades past. If it were to bubble up to that level, could that potentially be something that the state police would be involved with?
Oh, there's no question the state police would be out in front of that, because there are cases, if a complaint came into the state police, they would have a responsibility to investigate that, and as they have in the past, and that includes many cases from the diocese. The diocese has always, in my view, cooperated in those cases, and I'm sure that at some point the new superintendent, Jim Manny, will be assessing those cases.
Anything else you want folks to know, especially pertaining to the role, having been there, that maybe you don't think the sort of average Rhode Islander knows what it's like to oversee an entire state police? Yeah,
it's a good question, and a good opportunity for me to talk about the state police in the respect that they're sometimes the last bastion of ethical hope in some cases, only in some cases, where they have to take a good hard look. I remember when I was superintendent of the state police, there were a couple of cases where other people just didn't want to look in that direction. And I had a fiduciary responsibility to do that, and which resulted in criminal cases. But ethics and fairness and honesty are first and foremost, and are hammered home every day with the members of the state police. And I'm just very pleased with what they've done over the years since I've left, and I know they will continue to under the tutelage of and under the leadership of Jim Manny.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time to come back here into the studio to give us a little insight into the future head of the Rhode Island State Police here. So, Brendan Daugherty, thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate it. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. We'd like to thank former Superintendent of the Rhode Island State Police, Brendan Doherty, to come in and give us his perspective of Governor Gene Raimondo's pick, Jim Manning, to head the state police. And of course, want to thank Bob Whitcomb, GoLocal columnist, for joining us here in studio to talk local news and politics. Let's go national first. Let's talk about the federal government shutdown.
Yeah, no big effect yet, but I think within a week or so it's going to have an economic effect because there are a lot of people out there, at least several thousand people, who can't spend any money. This is not good. Certainly it's very bad for the many fine bars and restaurants in Greater Washington. So no, but it's going to be a serious, I think, economic drag. There's always sort of a lag time, usually in the holidays, and most of us are in a coma for this week, part of next. But I think after that, if they don't resolve this thing, and I think the way to resolve it, frankly, is to get Trump to agree to some kind of regularization of the illegals already here. What do they call them? You know, the kids, the dreamers.
Dreamers, yep.
And then the Democrats get that, and then he gets a stupid wall. By the way, a reminder, the wall cannot be built in long stretches because it's mountainous and it's cliffs and Gila monsters.
So you think he'll get the wall?
No, I think at the end of the day, there'll be some fences. Remember, he's backing off on that. So they can call it what they want, a fence. How about a picket fence? Kind of quaint, you know, like some father knows best, a white picket fence?
I don't think it would be a white picket fence.
Yeah.
We had the head of the Rhode Island Latino PAC, Joseph Molina Flynn, in earlier this week,
Yeah.
and his thought was, the president may or may not actually want it, just likes the idea of it, using it as a talking point and
Well, one of the most
energizing the base.
entertaining thing, the people who are most terrified of these immigrants are people who live in areas with the fewest immigrants. And by the way, the immigrants have a much lower crime rate than native-born people. But, oh well, details. But I think they'll come out to some kind of deal like that. It may involve the dreamers. You know, fix the dreamers, regularize some of these people who are here illegally, either their own volition or because they were brought here. And then, you know, you can have some nice photo ops with a big wall in some places. Maybe, you know, in heavily populated areas like a 400-foot high wall in El Paso or something, you know, kind of in the urban areas. The desert, I don't know. I think that's a little unlikely that they could build a high wall across the desert and the mountains.
Well, obviously there's been a lot of attention paid to
I know that's going to happen.
Migrants coming over and the deaths of 2 children in just a short period of time. Again, Joseph Molina Flynn spoke to that as well, about addressing the needs specifically of children being exposed to harsh conditions.
We should be honest, though. The kids could have been sick anyway. Children die.
That's what they said.
Children die.
And that's what he said, too. People die in custody all the time.
Right, pneumonia, whatever. It may have had nothing to do with being in custody. The border officials may have had nothing to do with that death, but certainly it's a tragedy, it's very sad, and it's certainly politically it's painful for the Trump administration.
Well, we'll see what happens at the federal government level here. Speaking of shutdowns, sort of the news that's been
How can they tell, right?
Speaking of news that has been dominating here, obviously, has been the case of the Foxy Lady, where it was purported
the spiritual capital of New England.
So, you know, it's interesting that folks say, you know, well, why the focus on the Foxy? We've covered the Board of Licenses extensively here at GoLocal and how they manage clubs and nightlife that have issues, and they usually pertain to issues of safety and violence.
Right.
And in this particular case, apparently the Foxy Lady has, you know, not even come before the Board of Licenses with any infraction. So the lawyers for the Foxy Lady say, whoa, okay, where's restorative justice here? You know, how do you go from 0 to 60 and say we need to be closed? You know, so it's just garnering that attention, you know, from that legal standpoint. And then, of course, it's just the Foxy Lady.
Yeah, the fact that everyone knows establishments like that, the employees, the talent, as we call it in the television business.
Should have been closed.
That's right. It should have been closed a long time ago. We know there's side. How do I put this? They're peripheral sources of revenue.
Their side business that might not be on the books.
Everybody knows that places like that, the employees supplement their income.
So you say, sure, close it. You think it should be closed?
Probably should be closed, yeah. Even though I kind of miss that tawdry aspect that makes Providence sort of the New Orleans of the North.
But here's what happens, and you see it, and we report on this all the time, too. The Board of Licenses oftentimes might take a more heavy approach and come down with some sanctions, and then the lawyers for the clubs go to the DBR. We actually talked with lawyer Peter Pacharka, and he said, look, there's competing interests. You have very much entrenched town interests, neighborhood interests, if there's something going on with the club.
Probably even have First Amendment. You know, I can do whatever I want in front of people as long as they pay.
Well, and then they go to the DBR, and the DBR says, actually, that doesn't hold water, and we're going to give you your license back. I mean, it kind of showed the disconnect of what happens at the Board of Licenses and what happens at the DBR. Now, in this case, because there's several licenses with the adult entertainment license, that one goes to the Supreme Court and the others go to the DBR.
Right. I think the other thing to bear in mind, the Foxy Lady is by far the most famous establishment of its kind. So they may be making an example of that just because it's so famous. I mean, it's known all over New England. They have a clientele that draws from all 6 states, and I have a feeling they, you know, it's as the French say, pour encourage les autres, you know, to terrify the others. And so I think there's something to it. But the business that goes on in these places is besides the performance and I'm sure the delicious food, the extensive wine list. There's nothing new about it. Everybody knows what goes on in these places, and let's face it, a lot of the employees' income is not declared on the federal tax return.
Speaking of the finance, let's go over to the wild ride we've been on with the stock market here. The past few months, and then the past week itself, you know, the
crazy,
the biggest
900 point, you know, moves. It went up 9,
and
it
then
went down,
the drop, and then the
goes up again.
Surge.
I think some of this is probably due to automated trading. You know, kind of using artificial intelligence.
Okay.
You know, you may recall a few years ago we had the flash crash. I think that there's probably an element of that. The other thing is there's so much uncertainty now. We're kind of at the cusp of things. A lot of people fear the recession may start next year instead of 2020. Most economists, I think now, and there's sort of a rough consensus is that we'll have a downturn by 2020. Nobody knows for sure. You've got the oil prices all over the place. You've got instability in the Middle East. You have very unstable administration here. Nobody knows what the monetary and the fiscal policy is going to be. So I think people feel pulled all over the place. But the other thing to remember with these huge absolute numbers is the stock market's very high. So when you say something goes up 1,000 points, it's not as ominous as you think. I remember at 87, which was the biggest, I think, single-day crash. And by the way, the recession after the 87 crash didn't begin for a couple of years. It was 25% in one day. I think it was 550 points, something like that.
And that was at that level in the 80s.
The percentage, it's the percentage.
It's
the percentage. A crash, I think these days, I think viewers should be concerned. I think a 10% fall is a crash. We're talking 2-3% up and down.
But all eyes certainly on the stock market. And speaking of eyes, we've got your notes here to what we can expect.
No, we talk about New Year's. You know why everybody should have New Year's cards instead of Christmas cards. Because if you're late, you're slow. You can keep sending them out at least through Martin Luther King Day.
Happy New
Year,
very handy. All through the year. Okay.
Also, the very interesting piece that ran and GoLocal, along with a lot of other interesting pieces by Brian about the end of zoning. These big houses on the east side of Providence and other old cities that have been, were inhabited by people with maids and a whole bunch of children. Many of these things are now being converted to sometimes sort of off the books, functions, students, and so on. So Brian Bishop, in this very interesting piece in GoLocal, talks about sort of the future of zoning in general. This sort of turn of the last century, city beautiful, housing goes here, commerce goes here. It may be time to review that paradigm.
Okay, look at zoning, looking at New Year's, and
then NEPAL. NEPAL is NEPOOL. That's this New England organization dominated by utilities and power plant operators that seems to have a huge control over our electric rates. And it's not transparent. Their meetings are not public. And
we saw the piece in GoLocal this week about us having the highest utility costs.
Yeah, highest, and that got me thinking. And
you were poking around a little bit.
New Hampshire Public Radio did a good story about that. Who are these people? And these are private beings, and they're making the recommendations to the feds where power lines should be, all this other stuff, very important stuff that eventually affect rates. And it seems to be this organization seems to be devoted to the interest of the utilities and the power plant operators.
Very interesting.
We need to know more about that.
So you need to read Bob's column to know more about that.
Yeah, and then I talk a little bit about the Middle East. I do think that Trump is right in the sense we can never win there, but you don't pull out without telling your allies. You don't betray your allies. The Kurds, in this case, or the Taliban, the Kurds in Iraq and Syria, the Taliban in Afghanistan. The lack of consultation is very dangerous because you become seen as an unreliable partner, which we are. And there's another kind of crazy story I staggered into. In Norwich, Connecticut, we've all heard about churches closing and then being turned into other things like maybe the next Foxy Lady. In fact, there, the bank closed, a beautiful old bank building, I think it's stone, in the middle of that old mill town, and a church is buying it. Which is a nice switch. And you look at it, banks kind of look like churches a little bit. They're, as the headline says, from commerce to Christ. And I think this is very, very interesting. And next week soon, we've got to talk more about all these closed malls. How many of them could be converted into housing? Housing prices are very, very high. People need places to live. We've got this affordable housing crisis all over the country. I wonder if some of these old malls might be a partial answer to this stuff.
Well, if you want to learn more, you have to read Bob Wickham's column this weekend. As always, Bob,
whether you want to or not.
Whether you want to or not.
Happy
Don't
New
go
Year.
anywhere. We're going to be back here momentarily with Ray Rickman, former state representative, deputy secretary of state, and now heads up Stages of Freedom to give his big view.
Very good.
Oh, Happy New Year, everybody. I've got a whole bunch of ideas. One, we don't acknowledge this, but education is normally fitted up for the society. There was a Rhode Islanders, majority, needed to work in a jury factory. That's all. Say 1930, 33% of the population is doing that. Then all of a sudden the jury factories are less and less, the factories fewer workers, and we need to adapt. But education is policy. So in the 1950s, Mr. Eisenhower and others decided that we needed to combat the successes the Soviets were having, and we needed to know more algebra and more physics and more everything than we ever needed to know before. Now, I'm not sure they were right. I think 1-2% of us needed to know that so that we could go to the space program and make it work. We've been bringing a lot of Germans after World War II to make certain things work, and they were getting old, and we needed a bunch of 25-year-olds to jump in. But they decided to educate the entire nation with these kind of new ideas in science. And now, of course, we're all supposed to be computer geeks, giants, the best in the world on these things because we're worried about the Chinese and others. I'm worried about grammar. I'm worried about literature. I'm worried about basic math. Basic math. I would like to see a summit. This is my big idea. I'd like to see a summit on what education in elementary school should look like 5 years from today. I think this is an 18-month summit. I watched the mayor of Central Falls, I watched the superintendent of Central Falls take some aggressive, progressive first steps. I'm very impressed with both of them. They outlined 6, 7 things new to do. Not reforms, but new to do. I think there's a need for 10 or 12 additional steps. I think we need to look at the whole educational system, all these reforms. I've been in Providence almost 40 years, and I believe Providence Public Schools have had 11 reforms during that time, of which none of them have taken hold or taken place or made the system better. In fact, the reforms have made the system worse because we're so busy doing nothing except getting ready to do something. I'd like to see a summit. I'd actually like to see the mayor of Central Falls ask 5 other mayors to sit down to begin this conversation. What should our educational system look like 5 years from today? And I don't think it's reform. I don't think we need to go find something someplace else and implement it here. Eva Marcuse the other day said something very interesting, and that is 5 years ago, Governor Chafee and she was head of state education board at that time, they talked to the people in Massachusetts, and then we get a new governor, a new head of education, and then nothing comes of it. Let's sit down and make a road map. Let's make a road map. Happy New Year.
Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us this noontime show before what shall be a long weekend. You can follow GoLocal Prov online and see us on Facebook. We'll be back in studio next week. We'll be out on New Year's Eve on Monday. The General Assembly is going to be in on Tuesday as the first Tuesday of the month on New Year's Day to have members there to be sworn in. So we look forward to seeing you here in the new year in downtown Providence. We appreciate your watching. But again, we'll be checking in throughout the weekend with you with more content on GoLocalProv.com. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel.